Hello,
Good
everybody.
evening.
It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. I am Chris Weave. This is Starfleet Tactical. I have with me LYSSA, and I also have, as always, and Chris Carlson, not as always, but always a treat when Chris comes on. And we're all going to get together and not speak for our employers, although I think that technically I'm the only one that actually applies to these days. But
I do technically have an employer.
You actually have a couple of employers, don't you?
Technically, so I'm technically a freelancer?
Yeah, but I mean, you got sponsors.
Yeah, I do.
So in any event, we're all here. The thing that seems to be keeping us all in common, despite the fact that we live like, multiple hundreds of miles apart from each other, is that it's raining all over the place. I think I'm the one with the warm weather, and that it's like, it is currently 53 degrees where I am, but it's raining.
No. It's 61 here. It's just supposed to drop tomorrow.
Oh, it's tomorrow.
30s.
Max.
Yeah, right now it's 61. High is 61, and then supposedly.
Anybody who's a praying person should, if praying is your thing, you should be praying for LYSSA, because she lives in a place that doesn't have snowplows, but is going to get wintry mix tomorrow. So things could be really, really ugly.
Well, thankfully, I don't have to go anywhere. However, my partner works at the airport. So
yes.
That's going to be interesting for him.
So hello to Michael and Rob and Olive and Wright and TJ and all the usual suspects. So it's good seeing you all on board today. So in any event, we're going to talk about, hold on a second, I need to reset my slide deck. We're going to talk about some engineering stuff, but Chris, you've been quiet. What have you been up to?
Oh, excuse me. The temperature is now slated to be even colder than I had originally said. Now that I pull up the weather app, tomorrow it's saying it's supposed to get down to 29 degrees.
Oh, a very pleasant temperature it is.
And then Monday is 27.
For what it's worth, once you get around freezing, I'd rather just zoom right on past freezing and get down to about 25 degrees, because...
Well, it looks like it's trying.
Okay, because I say this as somebody who did winter weather professionally for most of my life. You don't want to be at the freezing rain mark. You want to go right to snow.
Yeah, no. It almost never hits right to snow here.
Yeah.
We're only, like, even when we get snow, it's not snow. It's a mix of snow and sleet, usually. Like, almost 90% of the time.
I wish I would have gone and found that there's that picture that shows all the cars that have slid off the road on the interstate down by Atlanta. And my favorite...
To be fair, everyone in 2014 was making fun of Atlanta for that. But First off, Atlanta just, one, does not have the infrastructure because we never get snow. Like, if we get snow, it's like when was the last time we actually got any good amount of snow? Like every 5 years, maybe, like minimum. And then not only that year in particular, they were not predicting us to actually get hit as far south as we did that year. So they actually had they had already mobilized all of the shit, like, ready to go. But it was not in the right area.
Yeah.
It was way further north than they realized it was going to be. And so you had all of these people get stuck on the interstate because it hit earlier and it hit further south.
I love the picture where people had photoshopped in AT-AT walkers.
I love that one too. Yeah. I'm like,
so,
no, I drove through that. So that actually is appropriate.
I lived in DC for a long time, and I got to see some really bad snows and some weirdnesses there. I wasn't there the time where they weren't predicting snow at all, and then it came during the day, and they sent people home too late, and people ended up with, like, people that normally had 45-minute commutes ended up with 5-hour commutes.
I was on the north side of Atlanta. in Brookhaven because I went to Oglethorpe University. And I had class that day. So first off, in my, I think it was like my 11 something class, like noon class, we got the message while we were in class that, hey, 1:30 classes are canceled. I'm like, okay, I've technically got a 1:15 class because University Singers was an oddball class. Whereas like most classes were like 2 hours, it was only an hour, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm like, well, that's only 15 minutes and I have to still drive through Atlanta. So like, I'm going to get the fuck out of Dodge. And I left when it started snowing. Like it had just started flurrying as I was leaving. It took me 4 hours to get from Brookhaven to Fayetteville, where my hometown is.
Are those,
and I left.
How far are those? I have no idea. How far apart are those two places?
Entirely opposite sides of the city. Fayetteville is on the southwest side. Brookhaven is northeast.
Okay, but I mean, how big is that in miles? I mean, Atlanta's like 400 miles across, right?
Like 26 miles.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there was one time where I remember we woke up in the DC area. Chris probably remembers this too. We woke up and there was 7 inches of snow on the ground.
Or no, it might be long. It might be longer.
No forecast for snow. We woke up to 7 inches of snow on the ground. It's the only time that I've seen the anchors make fun of the weather guy. I remember at one point the anchor said something to the effect of, and now topper shut with the weather, God knows what good that will do, or something like that.
Okay, it's depending on the route, it's anywhere from like 35 to 39 miles.
Yeah.
Because again, opposite sides of the city, like literally opposite sides. But it's not a long distance. Like usually the thing that you hit traffic wise that makes it take as long as it normally does is going through Midtown. And even then, like if you're going through rush hour, usually takes no more than like 2 hours. And that's through rush hour traffic where it's stop and go.
Moving on to less trying issues than snow.
Yes, we should actually talk about tonight's topic.
Yes. Tonight's topic.
So let me go ahead and throw up the slides.
Do-do-do-do.
So, so this is going to be the first of probably 3 sessions, because the more I worked on slides, the more I realized this was bigger than I thought it was going to be. This is going to be probably the first on 3 sessions looking at a particular YouTube channel and some of the work that they've done and some of the issues that they bring up. Chris is a naval engineer among his many, many talents. And so he is a particularly good person to have involved with all this. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide and do some admin stuff. So next week we'll have a show. I'm available. I'm probably available on the 23rd, although there is a chance I may start my trip one day early. And if I do, then I won't be available on the 23rd. Definitely not available on the 30th. That's a change. It was a possibly before. Now it's a definitely no. And then yes on the 6th, and then no on the 13th, and then I'm good after that. Yes,
I believe it's January 20th. I will not be here.
Okay.
We're gonna be up in the mountains with some friends for Robert's birthday.
Ah, that sounds good. We will make it happen. We will make it happen without you. So we will.
It's either the 20th or the 27th. I don't remember which weekend technically is the one we've got the cabin for.
So let me point over to the additional caveats over there, specifically the one that says it's a TV show. So this is particularly problematic because we're especially going to look tonight and next time we're going to be looking at Star Trek, the original series primarily. And the original series is even worse than the other Star Trek shows about just doing stuff because it's a TV show. Like there's actually one part I'm leaving out on what we're going to talk about, the hangar bay on the original Enterprise. I'm leaving something out where there's some episodes where it was just easier for them to just have a wall So they just used a wall, which implies that maybe there's a door and there's no place for that door to be. And so, but I'm just ignoring it because I put that in the category of that is so clearly just a production decision, that I put it in the same category as they could have been doing this as a play in one of those things where they just sort of put chalk lines on the stage and they don't actually have anything on the stage, and they just, like, except for like a chair for the characters to sit in. It might as well be that. So
it's the stage positioning.
Yeah, it's a stage position.
Staging.
So it's clearly a TV show. We can talk about the topics. We can try to sort of make it all fit. Know in advance it isn't going to fit, but we can sort of highlight some of the issues involved. Okay, so We Travel by Night is a very interesting YouTube channel. The guy who does it basically it says in the about box that it's just, whatever sort of strikes his fancy, he decides he wants to do a video on it, he'll do a video on it. Maybe a quarter of the videos on the site are specifically videos like the type we're going to talk about tonight. We're not going to watch them because last time we tried watching something, next thing you know, there was copyright strikes, et cetera, and I'm not going to go there. I did take some screenshots.
You have the links for the YouTube
The links
videos?
are in the description. So if you go into the
Awesome.
description, you can see all the links are there. And I did take a screenshot from one that isn't linked in there, but all the other links are there. And so they're worth watching. Everything that this guy does is very high quality. So I would recommend that you all go and watch his stuff and like it and give him some views. But we're going to look at 4 videos from the original series and 2 from the Motion Picture Enterprise. The 4 original ones, and we're going to do 2 tonight. We're going to look at the bridge, and we're going to look at the hangar of the original Enterprise. And so everything that's here, there's some other illustrations too, but everything that's here that We Travel by Night, screenshots, the other things I've put up, all the property of the originators, not intending to violate their copyright. Chris and I are here to add educational value through criticisms and commentary, and LYSSA too, if she's going to participate in that. And
I'll join in as appropriate.
So we think this all fits under fair use, and where I've got information about who did it, I've put that up. I will admit there's a few things I should probably go and do another search on the internet and try to find the stuff. I wasn't as good about capturing that information when I downloaded some of the stuff the first time. So, okay. So let's do a little scene setting first. Here we have the original series Enterprise. The illustrations on the left, A, B, and C, are all from The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield, if I remember correctly. And then the top view and the side view on the right-hand side of the original Enterprise are also, I believe, from The Making of Star Trek. Those look like the same illustrations. And there's a few things to note here, like note exactly where the hangar bay is and the size of the hangar bay. And then note also the illustration B down there about how cavernous that hangar bay is. And then also it's probably worth noting, look at the secondary hull of the original Enterprise. I mean, it really sort of looks a lot like the primary hull in that it looks kind of like a building, although you'll note that approximately along the line of the main deflector there, along the line of the spike, you'll see some of those compartments look really, really tall. There's an entire deck that seems to be a little bit bigger than the other decks. And then a deck underneath it that looks smaller. I don't know what's going on there. That's never explained. But that's this is the closest thing we have to a canon source outside what we see on the screen for the original Enterprise. This is it. It's not a whole lot there. Chris, any comments?
No, you're presenting the drawings of where you saw them from.
Yep.
and pointing out that they're as close as we're going to get to, if you want to call it draft designs,
Yeah.
the actual vehicle, the ship itself.
There's just not a whole lot there. But what we do have, and
I like Michael's explanation, moving cargo.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities for those ones down.
I mean, if it is taller, it could be that it's a storage, primarily used for storage, that would be taller.
Yeah,
that is as good as an explanation.
So yeah, and that's a possibility. Now, Michael Weir also says engineering was located at the back of the saucer section by the impulse drive. You know, that's going to be the subject for next week.
Yep.
That comes explicitly from what we're seeing on the screen here, which is the Franz Joseph blueprints of the Enterprise. So Franz Joseph was an illustrator working in the aerospace industry. His daughter was a rabid Star Trek fan. He was like a draftsman. He worked for General Dynamics, and he actually was the guy who did some of the design work on the pylons for the F-111 aircraft. And the pylons on the wings, if you know anything about that aircraft, they were funky because it was a swing wing aircraft, and the pylons on the wings would have to rotate to keep the weapons facing forward in the windscreen. And so he was the guy who did that, but he wasn't a naval guy. And so his daughter is like a teenager at the time. She's a rabid Star Trek fan. Her dad has this particular skill set, and so she asked her dad to draw starships for the local fan club. And so he did. And next thing you know, we've got the tech manual, because at the time, he was able to get the rights to actually publish some of this stuff for dirt cheap, because, nobody thought that it was going to be worth anything. And then he did these blueprints that came out in 1975. And I remember when these blueprints came out. At one point, this set of blueprints was literally my most prized possession. And they're cool, and B, they're wrong. They're just plain wrong. We're going to talk about that. A few places where we're going to talk about some of the specifics, but that's where that main engineering is at the back of the primary hull comes from. It's specifically from Franz Joseph. Some of the places where I think it's wrong is one of the things that I always tell people, like, go through the blueprints and ask yourself the question, where's the structure? There's no structure in this. There's no framework. The ship has no bones. There's nothing holding the ship together except the decks and the walls and the outer hull. There's no framework that they're hanging stuff on. So, but let's see, what else was I going to say about this particular illustration? I don't think there was anything else I was going to say about this, but I do think, okay, yeah, we're going to come back to this illustration when we start talking about the bridge. Note, for instance, that the bridge does not face forward. That's going to be one of the things we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's another interpretation of that. Now, this also is just plain wrong, and on the next slide, I'll go into some of the details as to why I think this is just plain wrong. But it's interesting in that you'll note there is nothing in this that looks like what we end up seeing in the movies with the linear intermix shaft and the vertical shaft and all that other engineering stuff in the secondary hull. We don't see any of that. What we see, and what Franz Joseph explicitly says, is that all the matter, antimatter, warp stuff, the reactor, et cetera, is in the engine nacelles. None of that is in the rest of the starship. It's all in the nacelles. And that, if you think that that's the case, then one of two things is the case. Either that's the case, and then they changed all that going forward, or that's wrong, And there was always this engineering plant in the secondary hull. And it's unclear as to which one that is. But here is an interpretation that shows that. You have a linear intermix shaft at the top of the secondary hull. Directly in front of it, at the base of the dorsal, you have main engineering in this drawing. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a couple of very interesting drawings that are sort of cutaways that show the sort of from the door of the hangar deck looking forward, seeing what you see. And then below that, you see the engineering space. At the top there, it's kind of maybe a little small on some monitors, but on top, what you're looking at is you're looking back in that vent area at the back of engineering where there's the giant pipes. That's what that yellowish thing in the middle is there. And then down at the bottom, what you're seeing is bottles holding the antimatter. And so that very heavily borrows from what we see in later designs and sort of retrofits it onto the original Enterprise design. I think this is wrong also. Okay, did I? Oh, I had an extra slide in there. Okay, I think it's wrong also. I think that doesn't work for a couple of reasons. The first is, if you look at where the pylons are in illustration A, the struts, the pylons go from the engines directly through the center of rotation of the secondary hull, right? Go right through the middle. You don't see that in the movie Enterprise. In the movie Enterprise, they sort of attach on the top, and you see that linear shaft in all the illustrations, all the cutaways. It's along the top. We'll see that later on. We'll see that next week. There's an illustration I'm going to use that shows it next week. But that shaft is along the top, and it works out that the way they come in, they come directly into that shaft. For this one, the intermix shaft, if you were going to do this, you'd expect that the intermix shaft would be along that same axis, which is not at the top of the secondary hull. You'd expect it, or at least I would expect it, to be along the middle of the secondary hull if you were going to do that. And we don't see that in this illustration. Now, it's hard to see because this is so small, but one of the things I noticed is that the pipes in that section of the engineering in the back, they're angled like this. And it actually works out that if you moved main engineering down, you just kept moving it down until it gets to about the middle, those pipes are at the exact right angle to line up with the pylons. Now, it does beg the question of what are they feeding in through those pipes, because those are, it's not coming from the middle like this, it's coming like that. So what's the source? What's coming in from there? That implies to me that maybe there's a couple of places where it's getting matter and antimatter below and mixing them or something like that, that there's something else that's more complicated taking place, if that is indeed the case. Another place where this is wrong is that you see something that you actually see on that Stephen Whitfield illustration earlier, which I think was actually done by Matt Jeffries. In that the pylons seem to come directly into the hangar bay. And that strikes me as, shall we say, problematic.
I mean, it could be the case that it's some kind of coolant, Olive.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Olive said coolant. So it could be the case that maybe there's some coolant that is being introduced that we're unaware of, that they never talk about because it's a TV show.
It's not necessarily that those pipes are doing warp plasma. Maybe there's something else that's doing the work.
Honestly, coolant's as good a guess as any, because like the big thing, even in space, is getting rid of heat.
Yeah, could be.
So it could be that it's some way for the system to cool off. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be a coolant being introduced. It could just be that happens to be an exhaust pipe.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Now I'll note that none of this is canon. My idea isn't canon. I just sort of noticed that those pipes would angle that way. The angle would match if you moved the engineering down from where they show it here. That's just my guess. Let's see. There was something else I was going to say. Okay, so on D, that circled area there, the support struts in this illustration and in the previous illustration, and in the Franz Josef illustration, right? If you go back to Franz Josef, he's got it the same way. The struts attached to the hull right where the hangar deck is. Mm-hmm. Chris, you're an engineer. What do you think about that idea?
Well, it is a little problematic. I mean,
that doesn't seem, as someone who's not an engineer, that doesn't seem the most structurally sound decision.
It's not. On top of that, as Chris has pointed out, we don't see any structure in any of this. And
we don't. Yeah.
And you know, where your propulsion plant connects to the ship, that's where your largest concentration of forces are going to be. And a lot of it's going to be shear forces. They're gonna move not in compression or tension, but sideways. And those tend to be more problematic than the simple tension and compression, because you're dealing with moments, torque, twitch. And even though there's not drag in terms of atmospheric in here, you still have inertia. All these little bits and pieces are going to react differently.
Yeah. And, okay, so let's just stipulate for purposes of this conversation that when the warp engines work, they're warping space-time. And so that warp effect applies to all the ship equally. So it's not the fact that the engines are dragging the rest of the ship along in the way that a rocket would be, but that it's moving the entire ship as sort of one thing all together. The forces are all equalized, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a result, when the warp engines are operating, it's not trying to rip the warp engines off the hull. But you know what? When the impulse engines are operating, they're trying to rip the,
now we have a problem.
And the one thing you can guarantee is that those warp engines are big and heavy. They're massive.
Oh yeah.
And so when you've got the impulse deck,
there's a reason why they have to make that stuff in space.
Yeah.
Because
and
you couldn't get it off of a gravity well. No way.
Yeah. And the nacelle is very, very long. And so when the impulse engines are firing, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, this is acting like a pendulum, right? I mean, it's gonna want to sort of do the seesaw thing.
It's gonna do a little bit of that, depending, but it's really when you get down to maneuvering, that things get really interesting. I mean, if you're starting from stop and you just go to quarter or half impulse, you build up relatively slowly, so the whole hull catches on. But when you start trying to do maneuvers, that's when things can be a little problematic in terms of where you start getting these torques and flexing going on.
Now, I had this conversation at one point with Pat, and Pat's response, Pat, not the engineer, pilot, not an engineer. Pat's response was, well, I guess the hull's just really strong. To which my response is, okay, I've been a tech support engineer. I've never been like a material engineer, et cetera, et cetera. I was a computer engineer type guy. But I look at this and I go, it's bad engineering when you do something the wrong way and then try to fix it with your material science.
Well, on top of that, the weight of the hull to give you the kind of strength you're talking about would be massive.
Yeah.
That's why we do frames.
Yeah.
Is to get away from having a hull, group one weight. Let's go back to that episode.
Yep.
That's just a massive piece. So, but engineering's for another show. Move on.
We're going to talk about engineering. So I love some of the things about this illustration. I just think it's wrong. I like the idea of this illustration, but I think it's wrong. Okay. So let's talk about the Enterprise bridge mystery. So remember, if we go back to that Franz Josef one, and we're going to do something very similar to that in a moment. If we go back to that Franz Joseph one, it's at an angle. It's at a 36-degree angle. So why would you have it at a 36-degree angle off to the side? Why is it not the case that why is he making the argument that Kirk isn't facing forward, he's facing off to one side 36 degrees? Well, it all has to do with that knob in the back, right? That knob in the back should be where that elevator shaft is. If we go back, see, you've got that elevator shaft off to one side because the elevator's off to one side, and there's where the shaft is. And if you look at the top of the model, I'm not going to go back to that other drawing because it's so small. If you look at the top, oh, actually, if you look in the very lower left-hand corner, that's an external view, and there's a little knob on the model there. It's clear that that's where the elevator shaft is on the model. And so the question is, but that's not where the elevator is. So that's the explanation as to why they think they're at a 36-degree angle, to make the inside and the outside fit.
Yeah, that's having to get creative with how to explain a set design versus a engineering design.
Now, it is so all these videos that we're talking about here, it's worth going and watching all of them. But this one has, one of the things I like about this video is he talks about all the set design reasons why you wanted it set up the way it is, why you want Spock in a particular location, and why you want the angle that they have, and etc., and why you want the door where it is, etc. And he explains all that stuff. And so it basically boils down to the set design is there for reasons having to do with making a TV show. And you have to, if you're drawing blueprints, you have to offset it. Okay, so let's come up with some in-universe reasons as to why this is the case. I think my first in-universe reason, because why would you design the ship that way? Why wouldn't you just have it, why wouldn't you put the elevator at the back? Why, from a ship perspective, do they care? I think actually that you can make the argument that what's really going on here is the original Enterprise, when the Enterprise first came out, it had the elevator directly behind. At some point, Starfleet started replacing the bridge modules on all the ships they had. And they decided they only wanted to build one type of module rather than two. And so some of the ships ended up with it working just perfectly. And some of them ended up at a 36-degree angle as a result. And they figured we've got inertial dampeners and this and that, artificial gravity, et cetera, to sort of take it out. It doesn't really matter that we're off to one side. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so that's my first explanation, that it's just it's a ease of manufacturing thing. They did it that way, and then because it was easier than trying to sort of redesign the primary hull to move stuff around.
You're trying to make excuses for the difference between the production set and the modelers.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about ease of being able to look at things, there should not be a position directly behind the captain. That's where the turbolift should come. Spock and all the others should be rotated further forward in a more of a traditional submarine design for control, if you will.
Yep.
And having played around in a couple of those, that works just fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you've got all these controls that nobody in the original series that nobody ever sits at. There's
here's another thing to take into account. In a spaceship that does not have any windows for the command center, why the fuck is the bridge on the top floor? You don't need it up there.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah, okay. So let's
that just puts your command group
let's talk
in one of the most vulnerable positions they could be on the ship.
let's talk about that. Let's talk about windows. Let's talk about those big view screens. Let's talk about all the positions on the bridge. It was doing this section of the thing where I realized that this was three episodes, not 2, because I realized there was way more to talk about it on the bridge than I thought there was. Okay, so here's my take on it being on the top. I think that at some point Starfleet's, you can make the argument that Starfleet made a calculation that went something like this. It doesn't matter where you put it, because if your shields are down, the ship is in a pre-plasma state. That when ships takes damage, they're usually destroyed, or their assumption is they're usually destroyed because of antimatter and all the other stuff, right? It's likely to just go high order. I'm stunned at the number of starships that we see in this episode, in the show, where the antimatter containment has not failed. Everything else on the ship has failed, but antimatter containment didn't fail. That's pretty impressive. And so, given that that's the case, they put it on the top because it makes it easy to remove. It plugs right into the top, right on top of the computer core, and they can pull it out and put a new one on if they need to. And that I think that Starfleet replaces their bridges surprisingly often. That it's sort of, I won't say that it's a routine thing that you just sort of go in for the weekend and they replace your bridge, but I think that basically when you go in for your 5-year, every 5 years and you spend 9 months in the yard, I think they replace your bridge.
Probably.
Yeah, well, the amount of time we saw the changes on the bridge in Next Generation, they were doing it on a weekly basis, for God's sake.
Seriously, go back. There's a YouTube channel called Junk Ball, and he specifically does one about all the changes in the Next Gen bridge. They were making multiple changes per season. I knew that they had made a few, but the number of times they changed the color of the carpet, the number of times they changed the paneling, I mean, they're like making multiple changes per season. They were constantly changing that bridge.
Which gets us back to, this is not an engineering requirement. This is a production value. And to make changes because the viewers don't want to keep looking at the same thing all the time.
Yeah. Well, also with the carpet in particular, I'm just going to point out that in real life, you are supposed to replace your carpet a hell of a lot more often than people do. And so you have to think about the sheer amount of people, production wise, and on a real military vessel that would be going through that carpet, and just how worn down it would be over a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
What is this carpet she speaks of?
I don't have carpet either.
I'm trying to remember if I saw carpet in the Admiral's stateroom. I can't remember if there's carpet in there.
Maybe a throw rug.
Yeah. But I like TJ's comment about an exposed bridge is a statement of trust in the systems of protection. That's a good comment.
Yeah. I mean, again.
Okay, but realistically speaking, obviously they're not a militaristic society. However, you are going into unexplored territory.
So, So let's talk about the main viewer for a second. The fact that they use the main viewer as a window always drives me crazy.
It's just nuts.
Yeah, because it's much more useful as a tactical display. It's much more using as a moving map indicator of some sort, right? I can think of about 20 different things I'd want to use that viewer for, and window is not one of them, or 98% of the time. And so I always thought that they sort of that they underutilized that window.
But space.
Yeah, I mean it's like sitting in if you're in your living room and you've got a picture window in front of you and all the lights are on inside your what do you see outside? Now, I guess the point, it is worth pointing out, it's not actually a window, it's actually a screen, so you don't have the lighting issues from the inside, but it's dark out. What are you looking at? What are you looking at? Right? I don't get it. I think that the way to do that if I were designing this, I would have had all those auxiliary functions, Spock, etc. Everybody else on the bridge would have been in the captain's forward frame of view.
Yep.
So that it makes it easier for him to communicate with them all. And Andy Presby points out, Andy's got a hypothesis about what we might have seen if they'd actually had a real special effects budget. He points out that there's a couple of view screens over each of those positions, right? And you can see them in this illustration.
Yeah.
So his hypothesis is that those view screens, that their primary purpose would be to put systems information up on one of those two screens, maybe both of them, so the captain can rotate. If he needs to know what's going on in the engineering, he can rotate and look at the engineering section, and there's these big displays. I mean, if you look at those displays, they are not well suited for the people that are sitting in front of them to see.
Lousy angle.
It's a lousy angle, and they're way up here, right? They're up high. It's the perfect angle.
It's very obviously meant for the captain's sake. I'm sure they've got actual smaller displays that they actually interact with on the bottom, and you kind of see that sometimes.
Yeah. And so I think that's the way it is for the captain to sort of stand and, to rotate around and look at stuff, and he can see the critical information by just glancing over. So, okay, so that's my first explanation, is that replacement bridge modules were standardized across the fleet. So they started replacing bridge modules, and they ended up with one that's now 36 degrees off, because it was a module that was just designed to fit in a bunch of different ships, and that's how they made it fit in that ship. I also think that there's another possibility, and that's that the bridge isn't actually centered under the dome. So if you look on the left-hand side, you see there's the Franz Josef bridge, right, with the 36-degree offset, and around the outside is a passageway. There's also like a bathroom back there, and there's a door off to the left-hand side of the main viewer that lets you get back there. And I've seen other ones that have things like, there's some emergency suit lockers and other stuff there, and things that you could put there. But it's basically, there's this big round passageway that goes all the way around. So what if you said, okay, no, there's not a passageway. What's really going on is that the bridge is not centered in that dome. The bridge is actually forward. So if you look at the very bad artwork on the right, the white circle represents the bridge pushed forward in the dome, which opens up enough space behind it to have a place where the elevator comes in, where the turbolift comes in over the captain's left shoulder. There's also a space back there to have another capsule just sitting there, ready, so that they've got one that they can move into place. If somebody takes a capsule off the bridge and leaves and goes down, they've got a spare. They can move it over right away if somebody else needs to leave. And then at the very back, you've got that turbolift shaft. I think that works just as well. That makes just as much sense to me as the 36-degree offset.
The biggest problem we have, Chris, with this, because your design actually makes the most sense. But the problem we have with the Constitution class in general is that the ship design is far too small to be holding all the crap it's holding. Its inside is bigger than the outside.
Well, hold that thought when we get to the hangar bay.
That makes sense. Don't think about this critically. Just enjoy. Suspend your disbelief.
And the shuttlecraft. The shuttlecrafts are bigger on the inside too.
Yeah. See,
oh yeah.
But listen, this is where you have people who try to analyze this stuff by looking at the data that they have, not realizing the data is not consistent.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The source, or within a source, or with other sources. And so they end up doing stuff like this to try to make it fit. And the answer really is what you said. It's a TV show. All the sets are put together to make it easier for them to shoot their scenes.
Yep, that's why the inside of the like the flyers, for example, are as big as they are, because it's not it's not a particularly large vessel. Like the shuttles are not by any means large.
So
they make them out to be bigger than they actually are because you have to have people, like space for people to be able to move around for production.
Yeah. And anybody who's been on a submarine, 2 people have to work really hard to pass in the passageway. That doesn't work great when you're trying to shoot a TV show.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at all the apartments that you see on TV shows. I mean,
oh yeah.
Don't
get me started about Friends.
Yeah, people ceilings and all the rest of it. I mean, that's just insane. It's just totally insane. But
how does Phoebe afford her apartment? The world will never know.
Yeah, I think the excuse with Monica, if I remember correctly, was
hers was a rent-controlled one that she took the rent over from her grandmother. Yes. That one makes sense. That I will give the benefit of the doubt because it was controlled payment.
That makes sense. It's just simple fraud.
Yeah, it's just simple fraud. But with Phoebe, for example, like how in the world is this freelance masseuse able to afford the apartment that she does, and she's also a busker?
Yeah,
you're telling me she doesn't have a roommate at the very least?
It doesn't make any sense.
In New York?
It doesn't.
Even in the 90s. Even in the 90s.
Okay, so moving on. So I pulled a picture from this is from one he did on the problem of the elevators in Star Trek VI. They moved the turbo lifts out even further to the sides, right? So they made them farther apart, and now they created a situation where it no longer fits in the model because they added this airlock complex in the back, and under the old system, the old locations, you could look at that and go, okay, I can see where the elevators fit. And there's like a single shaft going down, and there's an elevator off to either side, and it goes into the shaft and goes down. And hey, that works great. Now you've got a problem where it doesn't fit, and he created on the right-hand side, that is actually showing he created a couple of bulges that aren't actually there on the shooting model, and he sort of this was in motion when I captured it, and those elevator turbolift shafts are sort of going to the outside, but I got it because it's also got the corridor to nowhere. In the motion picture, you could see how this all went out. That basically, I think it worked out that you like went into the elevator, and the elevator did like a 90-degree turn or a 120-degree turn, and then you went out of the elevator into that area in the back there. But you could see how that all played out when they moved things around. There's now no longer a way to get to that complex in the back where the airlock is. It just doesn't make sense.
Honestly, Dustin, that makes more sense given that, like, again, we pointed out, how the hell are you fitting all of these things in this amount of space? Well, so, like, it going from 430 meters to 700 meters makes a lot more sense.
My radical interpretation is that one of the things that the transporter does is that when you're transporting in, it actually sort of converts you into a computer program, and everything that you see with people walking around inside the ship is just a virtual reality situation. I'm still working on the details of that explanation, but that would at least make
the Matrix
in the ship. Yeah, it just beams you into the Matrix, and then you're sort of in the Matrix.
Actually, it's that episode of Stargate Atlantis where they find the Atlanteans that were stuck on a ship in stasis.
Yeah.
And they were in the electronic version of the ship. And there was a wraith that managed to get in and disguise themselves as one of the crewmates. That's actually what's happening.
So I will say about what Dustin has to say there. One of the problems, though, that I have with, like, the Enterprise seems to be bigger in Discovery and in Strange New Worlds, but the problem is that when you see the turbo lifts moving around, it's a bigger hull that's entirely empty. So it's like, yeah, you got more space to put stuff, and then it's entirely empty. So, yeah. Okay, so moving on. So now we're going to move on to the hangar problem. Okay, so note the discrepancy between, on the right, we have the Franz Josef blueprint, which clearly shows that the hangar bay extends to in front of the pylons versus the Matt Jeffries drawing on the left-hand side that shows that the hangar bay stops before you get to the pylons. So these are the one is a canon source, but a very early one, and how authoritative. I mean, it's official, but we're mostly official. The other one is unofficial, but the other one actually matches largely what you see on the left-hand side for the schematic of the hangar bay, which is also from the Stephen Whitfield Making of Star Trek book. So it's also semi-official, right? It's same drawings. So, yeah.
Either way, I'm very concerned about the forces that are being put on this hull.
Yeah.
With the way that pylon is centered close to the hangar bay.
These are people that decided, if you look very carefully on the Franz Josef design, you'll see that underneath the hangar bay itself, there's a maintenance area for shuttles. And underneath that, there is a
bowling alley,
4-lane bowling alley with seating for 100 people. There's lots of stuff that doesn't make sense.
Things that in real life actually need like a fair amount of what's the word I'm thinking of? ADHD. Why?
You need more space.
Reinforcement.
You need. Well, we've already talked about the lack of any framing. That's going to be problematic throughout the thing. But depending if we go with how many shuttles supposedly the Constitution class runs around with, and if I remember correctly, it's 6.
There's I'm going to talk about this later on. There's in the episode of the Omega Glory, there's a reference to the Exeter having 4.
Okay.
But even 4, so we'll get to that. So too big in this, the Enterprise Hangar Problem was the shuttle bay too big. That's the name of the video. Too big in this case means too big for the model, i.e. the inside's bigger than the outside. And the short answer is yes. Yes. But let's take a little bit closer look at that. So the Star Trek Bible said the hangar deck was the size of a football field. So you can call it 300 by 160 or 360 by 160, depending upon whether you want to include the end zones. And that does not look like that fits at all.
Not even remotely.
Not even remotely. Now, I'm not inclined to. The Bible is just sort of a, hey, writers, let me give you an idea of approximately what we're dealing with here. So
now here's the one thing that is when you say hangar deck, is that like flight deck, or is that the entire hangar infrastructure?
So I'm primarily talking about the flight deck portion, right?
Okay.
The part that when you open not the part that you get to by the notional elevator the next level, but I'm talking about what would be the flight deck, so one of the things that Chris is alluding to there is that this looks like the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, and the hangar bay on an aircraft carrier is underneath the flight deck. And so it's a little bit different. Okay, so yeah, and you'll notice if just doing the measurement, it looks like the front is about 88 feet. The front of the secondary hull is about 88 feet in diameter, and the rear is about 62 feet in diameter. Oh, one thing I meant to say about 3 times now, and I haven't. I'm going to go back one. Okay. Note that nice curve on the bottom of the secondary hull. Beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful. Not there in the shooting model. That is not what the shooting model of the Enterprise looks like. It's in this illustration. It's in Franz Josef. It's in every set of blueprints, the nice curve of the secondary hull. The actual shooting model is a truncated off-center cone. In fact,
do we have a side-by-side?
I should have Should have done that.
Next week. Next time on Dragon Ball Z.
Next week, I will add to this slide deck a picture of the side view of the shooting model if I can find one. And the thing is, if you find an actual picture of the shooting model, it just like jumps and you're looking for it. It's like, oh my God, it just jumps out at you that every illustration of the Enterprise, every single illustration is wrong in that regard. Yeah. Okay. So here we go with that. Next one is, okay, so pylons to fantail. So if you look on the upper right-hand corner there, from the point where that arrow is approximately where the pylons are to the end of the top there is about 85 feet if you measure it on the exterior. But if you measure how big that hangar bay is based upon like the size of the shuttle, etc., you get something that's 123 feet long. And even with, if you say it extends underneath the pylons, I don't think you get another, maybe you get another 40 feet there. Maybe. But then you got all the pylon problems like that on the lower left-hand corner. That arrow is pointing to basically where it comes into the hull. There are no structural supports there. There are no power conduits there.
Go back to the slide that has, because I found a picture of them with the shooting model from the cage.
Okay.
Which part that was it you were referring to?
The secondary hull is just a truncated.
The bottom part.
It doesn't have that nice curve.
Yeah, it really doesn't.
Yeah, it's just straight along the bottom.
Yeah, it is straight.
Yeah, so I'll grab a screen capture. Okay, so no supports. We've already talked about all that stuff. Okay, so here's a picture from the original episode that it showed from the Galileo 7. Now, a personal pet peeve of mine, people talk about the Galileo 7 shuttle as if Galileo 7 is the name of the shuttle. The Galileo 7 is the name of the episode. And the Galileo 7 that episode title is referring to is the 7 people that were on board the Galileo. The name of the shuttle is, wait for it, Galileo, not Galileo 7.
But it says on the hull, it's the 7th shuttlecraft, which got back to my initial question of how many do they have.
I don't know where that comes from, but it's the Galileo.
Oh, I completely agree, but I just had to point that out.
Yeah, there is a 7 on there, so
we lost lock on that.
I can understand why people would think it's Galileo 7 versus just Galileo, because it just so happens coincidentally that there were 7 people on the ship.
So the shuttle is 21 feet long. Now, the inside is bigger than the outside, but the outside is 21 feet long, which means that the hangar bay is about 60 feet wide. And then you've probably got, if you assume that the alcoves that the hull has a thinness of 0, the depth of the hull is 0, and the alcoves on either side are only 5 foot deep, that gives you 70 feet across to fit into your 62 feet wide space.
Yeah. That's not a lot of wiggle room.
Not at all. Okay, so when they did the restored version, they changed that. And this was a sweep where he's going from the original on the left to the restoration on the right. You've already seen that original picture in the previous one. So I thought about taking 2 separate shots and taking out the little space in between and the resizing, and just said, screw it, I'm just going to take the one picture. And as you can see, when they did the restoration, they made the shuttle bay, a lot smaller. A lot smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is, how do I fit 4 shuttles in there? There is a belief that, and Franz Joseph shows this in his blueprints, there's a belief that square there is an elevator. And so it'll go down a level and there's a maintenance bay down there. And so
that would make sense. But even then,
totally
like, you would think they would still give them a little bit more wiggle room to move around, considering, you know, it's supposed to be like a flight deck.
But you could make that work. I mean, I've seen, you know, surface ships have flight decks that are smaller than that.
That's fair.
And they're dealing with a ship that may be subject to wave action, which is not, you know, landing a helicopter on a surface ship landing a helicopter on a surface ship is so complicated and can be so dangerous sometimes that they actually will winch the helicopter down. That's
fair.
They've got a mechanism whereby they drop a line from the helicopter. They attach the simplified version is they attach that line to a winch and they pull the helicopter down. And so the idea is that if you're on the helicopter, you're constantly giving it up so that if the ship comes up, the helicopter goes up. And if the ship goes down, it pulls the helicopter down. And then they winch the helicopter down to the deck as the pilot is trying to make the helicopter go higher. And so that way you never have to worry about the deck coming up and hitting the helicopter, which would be, to use the technical term, bad.
Law of gross tonnage.
Yeah, the helicopter loses that. So I think you've got places to put shuttles there and you can put them underneath. And if we went back to some of those earlier illustrations that show I think if you had, remember when I said that I think the intermix shaft is along the center line? That has a couple of added benefits, one of which is it can provide plasma directly to the navigational deflector, which, based upon what I see in the Next Gen Tech Manual and some other things, I think that navigational deflector is a warp field generating device that it uses for both the sensors and for deflecting. And so as a result of that, having a metric shit ton of power coming directly off a conduit directly from the warp core is a good thing. And it also means that at the back, that because it butts right up, potentially butts right up to the hangar bay based upon wherever you think main engineering is, if it butts right up on the hangar bay, you can pull big pieces of gear out through the hangar bay. And in some of the illustrations, it looks like there's some big doors at the back of the hangar bay. And my hypothesis is that's where if those are doors, that gives you access to the cargo space or to the engineering spaces, unless you pull stuff out.
Well, we can deal this a little bit later on, but I'm going to disagree with you that the deflect array is a generator. I'm going to say it's a moderator. It tweaks and shapes. If you look at the TNG Tech Manual under warp core, you will not find the deflector in that diagram.
Yeah. So next time is going to be really fun because Chris and I are going to have an argument about that.
Just about everything.
Well, and the thing is that, we're both right? Because it fits into the category of we're talking about made up science for a TV show. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, can we come up with a reasonable explanation that explains that is reasonably consistent without doing too gross a damage to what we actually see? And, you know, I think the key to those sorts of conversations is defining what too gross of damage it is, right? That's the big difference between like me on the one hand and my buddy Andy Presby on the other, is that I'm way more willing to, you can't make it all consistent. It's just not consistent. So at some point you have to throw away stuff that doesn't fit in because it just doesn't fit. I am pretty liberal in my willingness to throw stuff away.
Where I would tweak what you're saying is that Star Trek The Next Generation, between Okuda and Steinbeck, they understood the concept of consistency, which was absolutely missing in the original Star Trek series and in most of the follow-on Star Trek movies. The movies look nothing like, I mean, that wasn't a refitted Enterprise. It's a new ship. I mean,
yeah. And so there's an interesting story behind that. Originally, the plan was to give them a new ship. It's a new ship. It's Enterprise B. Right? They were just going to give them a new ship. And apparently the network went, you can't do that. People like the ship. You can't do that. And so they made them keep the ship. And so they came up with this, it's a refit. And so one of the in-universe explanations I've heard is that basically the exact same thing happened in the universe, that they were going to just decommission the Enterprise, and the public went, we love the Enterprise. You can't decommission the Enterprise. So they went, oh shit, they won't let us decommission it.
Like that's ever stopped.
We'll do a refit. And Chris, as a naval historian, probably remembers that there was I think it was the ABCDs, where wasn't that the ones where the Navy wanted to do a refit, and the refit was pretty darn close to the level of remove the ship's wheel, throw away the rest of the ship, bring a new ship in, reattach the ship's wheel. That's the refit.
I mean, if you remember when we talked about the ship construction,
yeah,
the refit of that magnitude would have taken longer, cost more than building a new ship from scratch.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the Belknap collision, so the U.S. in 1975, the USS Belknap collided with the USS John F. Kennedy. It resulted in gouging open a aviation fuel tank on the Kennedy, which then proceeded to dump like some tens of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, basically kerosene, down the stack and into the lit boilers of the Belknap, which resulted in a pretty impressive fire that basically melted the entire superstructure. I mean, it's like down to the deck. Belknap,
running into the flight deck and having a crew cut doesn't help.
Yeah. The thing is, Belknap was due to go into the yard to get an upgrade. She was going to get, was it NTU? I can't remember.
New threat upgrade.
She was going to get the new threat upgrade, but she was going to get a limited version of it because doing the full version of it was going to be too hard. Well, guess what? When you have to rebuild the entire superstructure,
it got easy.
By virtue of the fact that she had such tremendous damage, she got a better upgrade for less money.
Yep.
Now, it did take like 3 times as long, in part because they had not planned for replacing all that stuff. And so they needed to actually survey the damage, figure out what they could keep and not keep, cut away all the stuff they couldn't keep, design the new stuff to replace it all. And then
you have to sit down and kind of reverse engineer what you've got left.
It was
go from there.
It was a harder problem, but it was a cheaper problem also.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was actually the last of this, but here's where we're at. So, Chris, can you come on next week?
I think so. I don't see any reason why not.
So these dates, if Chris is unavailable, these dates might change because I might kick it down further to the right to a point where Chris can be on. So the current plan is next week we'll continue talking about, and we're going to talk about the engine room, and we're going to look specifically at where was main engineering and which direction did it face. And it's worth going and watching those videos on this. They're very interesting. And it's just, like the engineering set changed over time, and you see stuff that clearly doesn't make sense when the entity that was making the Klingons and the Federation guys fight. When it comes out of the ship, it doesn't seem to come out the correct side for the orientation that you think engineering is facing. So we don't know where engineering is, and we don't know which direction it's facing. There's lots of different opportunities for discussion on that. We're going to discuss that. And then we're going to start talking about the motion picture enterprise, specifically the question of the torpedo room complex at the bottom of the dorsal. How many torpedo rooms do they have, and how on earth can you make them all fit in that space? Because once again, the inside is bigger than the outside.
Yep, much.
And then we're going to talk about the dorsal and how did the turbolifts pass through it if there's an intermix shaft. The question now, we're going to argue about whether there's an intermix shaft there or not. That's one of the things that's going to happen. Andrew Probert clearly thinks there's an intermix shaft there because he actually drew it. I think Chris, based upon what he was telling me earlier today, is going to Chris Carlson is going to make a very Chris Weave kind of argument and say, yeah, I know that it's official, but the official stuff is wrong.
The official stuff doesn't make sense.
The official stuff doesn't make sense. It's all wrong because it's all made up, but the official stuff doesn't make sense. And so I think this will be a fun couple of episodes to, assuming we follow this timeline to finish out the year. I still want to do the Exordium read along at some point. I'm currently in the process of reading Martin Doherty's Sector Fleet, which was later reissued as Grand Fleet, talking about the Imperial Navy and the Traveler universe. He also did a book called The Imperial Navy that came out within the last couple of months. And I want to talk about these because I think there's a lot of very, very interesting elements in there. My buddy Tom Pope suggested to me earlier today that I should use the building. Remember, I did like 2 years ago now, I did my Building a Navy talk. I'm going to use basically the framework of building the Navy to go through and try to answer all the questions with regard to the Imperial Navy and Traveler and try to figure out how all that stuff works. And it's very, very interesting because you can tie back the Imperial Navy and Traveler as presented by Martin Doherty to the stuff we talked about when I talked about Julian Corbett's Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, where he talks about the flotilla and the fleet and how they interact with each other, and the guns of the fleet protect the flotilla, and every now and then the bad guys come out and try to whack the flotilla, so you need to be prepared to go out and whack the bad guys with bigger ships, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting thing. This does not surprise me. Doherty is somebody I'd really, really like to meet. He's worked as a defense analyst in Britain before. He's done some defense journalism stuff. And he writes science fiction on the side. So what's there not to like about this guy? So we're going to I'm going to spend some time talking about stuff in that universe. So, and then I also want to go through and talk about Le Foudre and the implications of Le Foudre as a model for science fiction ships and some things that we've seen. I've talked about some of this before with C.J. Cherryh's Alliance Union universe. I want to talk some more about that. And then I also want to go through a multi-part series going through James George's History of Warships, which is an excellent little book. Paints with a very broad brush, as he says in the intro. There's an exception to everything, but it's basically a 1-volume, relatively short history of all warship types. Mm-hmm. He talks about the development of destroyers. He talks about the development of cruisers, battleships, etc. My guess is I'm going to spend 3 episodes talking just about cruisers. And I'm also going to go through and compared that to things like I see in Star Trek. So to go back to what I was saying earlier, I really think that there are some sources that say that the Enterprise is a heavy cruiser. I think there's a word missing. I think it's heavy exploration cruiser. I think that's why the Miranda looks so different from the Constitution class. Why the Constitution has this big vulnerable neck. Right.
Because it is primarily meant for political things.
Well,
yeah,
where you're trying to show that you're a little bit more vulnerable in some regards, so you don't scare someone off.
But it's not just the Constitution class. I mean, if you look at the Saladin, the Scout. If you look at the Destroyer, if you take a look at the supposed Federation Dreadnought, even. It is characteristic. We don't see that neck until you get to the Miranda class, or the Avenger class as was originally called, way back when. So this was a design concept that didn't matter really what the function of the ship was. It was how the Federation did things, which was pretty stupid.
I think that with
and all of this can be explained away with a simple, it's a TV show and it looked cooler.
But I think I can come up with an in-universe explanation that goes like this. The Explorer class ships, and I'm not going to include Saladin in there. Saladin is not official. I'm talking about stuff you see on the screen. See the things that sort of look like Explorers from the original series on. Those things are designed. I think it's designed to get they're looking for a particular geometry between the navigational deflector and the engines. And I think that's what that's about. It's about, there are lots of other design considerations, and the vulnerability of that neck wasn't one of them, because they don't really view that as a warship. It is an armed exploration ship. When you start talking about the Miranda is designed to kick ass and take names.
Yeah.
It's got the big ass guns on it. It's got the big photon torpedo complex, and it's squat, and it's designed. I think the Miranda is designed as a warship with a secondary mission to do survey. Note, survey, not exploration. In my mind, the difference between the two is exploration is going where no man has gone before. Survey is going to where the guys that had gone where no man has gone before have gone already, and do
checking it out further.
Yeah, and do a detailed survey of the situation, right? So survey is farther behind. Survey is about making sure that you cross all the T's and dot all the I's, whereas exploration is just like go to a system, spend a couple of days there, sort of write everything down, send a message back home, go to the next system, that sort of stuff.
Yep.
So all right. I think that, and so basically, I just gave you, I've got a year's worth of material already planned. All I need to do is find time to do all the reading to make it happen.
Fair enough.
I think we're done. Are we done?
Are you guys done?
I think we have covered everything we were going to do for this episode.
Okay,
alrighty.
So let's, I'm looking. Michael Weir asked, "What does Matt Jeffries show in his blueprints that were used in Star Trek: The Motion Picture?" I'm not sure. I'm going to try to research that a little bit. Looking through a few things. Oh, it looks like right toward the Belknap. Oh, I didn't know that. So I've heard the story of the Belknap collision. Chris, somebody that you and I both know was on Belknap when it happened.
Oh, shit. Well, obviously they survived.
Yeah. And so was in CIC when it happened. And his name is in the report, although the redacted version of the report has his name crossed out, but was in the report because he was the last person to see one of the guys that died. He was the last person to see him alive, because that guy was in CIC when he died. And it's like if you were standing on one side of CIC, you lived. If you were standing on the other CIC, you died.
Oh, crap.
Yeah. And the comment that was made
Please
to me
tell me he's got a good therapist.
Oh, 1975, he's doing fine. And he's a great guy. But he also said that so the CIC on that ship was set up in such a way that it was like on the same level as the bridge, I think, or maybe a short stairway down, but it was close enough to the bridge that you could go back and forth. Mm-hmm. Somebody came from the bridge and said, we're going to hit the ship. He had time to come back and tell CIC that, and then he's turned to go back to the bridge, and they said, where are you going? And he goes, I'm going to go up and watch the collision. And he did. He made it back to the bridge in time to see the collision.
There are some very ugly photos online looking down on the top of Belknap. It was messy.
Yeah, it was bad. It was bad.
But
And it led
I'll
to,
be honest with you, I was surprised. I mean, I was a really young kid at the time, but when they had the news reports on it, I was surprised they saved the ship with the amount of fuel that got dumped on her and started burning.
yeah.
That was very impressive.
Well, lucky that it was kerosene, JP4. I think it was JP4.
Wow. Okay, for the record, I've never seen pictures of this before, and I'm looking at them for the first time.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Lucky that it was JP4 as opposed to 200 octane avgas.
Yes,
yeah.
Jet engines don't like that. It kind of gets a bit warm in there.
So, U.S. damage control is really pretty good. They did an excellent job saving the ship. And I've talked about this previously, but it's worth pointing out again. There's a YouTube channel called Greg's Planes and Automobiles, or Greg's Airplanes and Automobiles, I think. And Chris, you would love this guy. He does mostly World War II airplanes. And he's a pilot, and he's some sort of consultant for the commercial aviation industry or something like that. And he runs an engine performance shop on the side. So like it says airplanes and automobiles. I don't think I've ever seen a video come up on that channel that's actually about cars. It's all about airplanes, and 98% of them are World War II piston engine aircraft that he's talking about. And like really seriously detailed stuff. And he used the P-47 as his showcase system to explain all of the concepts, engine compression ratios and this, and superchargers versus turbochargers and all that other stuff. He used the P-47 as the thing. And so if you look, he's got like 7 separate episodes in the P-47 totaling about 6 hours. Like there's an entire episode that's just on dive performance. And
well, that radial engine was it the R2800 or something like that, is an absolute beast of an engine. It is. And you can abuse it and it's still going to work.
Yeah, Curtis Wright, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, P-47s came back with rotors gone, with pistons gone.
Yeah.
Couldn't do that with a Merlin.
P-47 is my candidate for most important fighter on the U.S. side. Now, you can make the argument for the Hellcat, but I think the Hellcat got a lot of kills shooting down guys that had 10 flight hours. Yeah, and so, I mean, it shot down a lot of people that had no business being in the air. But I think
surprised they made it to the air.
Yeah, but the P-47 the P-47 got all their kills early in the war, right? The Hellcat got all its kills late in the war. P-47 got all its kills at the beginning of the war, or relatively early. And I think it was, there's a lot of reasons to think that. The other thing that I never really appreciated until watching his show is how many different variations of all those aircraft there was.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there's like 20 different variations of the P-47.
Standardization went out the window. I mean, they found they made little niggly changes, and that's a spiral development demonstrator if I ever saw one.
Yeah, and including things like the engine would change over the compression ratios, and some of those engines were twice what they were at the end of the war than what they were at the beginning of the war. Some of that was just like, okay, we did it and it didn't blow up. So go ahead and do it, right? So go ahead and do it. We can get more out of this than we thought we could. So go ahead and tune it accordingly. But some of it was, they just worked on improving all that stuff.
I'll take a look at some of his videos. As you probably know, World War II aircraft is a secondary thing for me.
Yeah.
I've got too much. I mean, right now I'm still trying to wrap my head around a nation building a guided missile destroyer that didn't think it needed a height-finding radar. Type 42s. Type 42s. The Brits.
I'm sorry, the Brits?
Type 42s, they went to sea without a height finder. And
was it because it was late, or were they just not planning on having one?
No, they were cheap.
Like the budget. Yeah.
Is there any bad British decision that wasn't based on money?
I don't know, but it seems to be a driver.
Yeah.
I hate having to make a rule change to accommodate this, but I had to make a rule change. It just, for a couple of days, I just kept going, and then I pulled out Norman Friedman's book on British frigates and destroyers of World War II and after. Let's just say Norm doesn't have a lot of patience for British parsimony.
Does Norm have patience for anything?
Yeah, a little.
Okay. You know him a lot better than I do. Like my guess is if you said my name to him, he wouldn't remember me.
I have, and he didn't.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. That doesn't surprise me at all. I've met him a couple of times. Yeah. It was usually in situations where I was one of the 20 people in the audience, and had very brief conversations with him. And so he might recognize me if he saw me as somebody that he had seen previously. But that's
I didn't have a photo, so I didn't have that.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect him to remember me. But like with my friend Walter Hunt, I always say, I met Walter at a con in Baltimore. He met me at PhilCon in Philadelphia like 5 years later, because he just doesn't remember me from the first meeting, nor should he. I was just some fan. He was sitting at the author table in the dealer's room. Nobody was talking to him. I had nothing better to do. I went up and talked to the guy and said, tell me about your book. And he did. And when I met him 5 years later at PhilCon,
See, that's how I ended up becoming friends with like a band that was signed by Fueled by Ramen back in high school. It had decided to rain when we were at the concert. So like we were just all chilling under the actual awning area, and my friend and I were chatting it up with the headliner band, and we're just doing our thing, and ended up with like 3/4 of them as friends on Facebook.
That's fantastic. See, that's one of the things, for those in the audience who haven't been to a science fiction convention, people are always surprised when I say things like, they'll mention their favorite author, and I'll say, oh yeah, Bob's a good guy. I like Bob a lot. And they go like, you know him?
Oh yeah. No, like,
yeah,
my players like will be talking about like D&D TikTokers, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, like they're a good friend.
Yeah, well, the thing is, how do you know these people? I went to a science fiction convention and I walked up and talked to them.
Yeah.
And you do that enough times, then eventually when you walk up and talk to them, they go, oh,
they
hi,
know your
Chris,
name.
How are you doing?
Exactly. They're
not,
people too. Just, like, chat them up.
It's not.
Sometimes you get lucky and they actually remember you the next time.
So it's good.
Speaking of next time.
Yeah, speaking of next time.
So, you and I should talk a little bit about putting some diagrams together on this silly thing you like to call an intermix chamber that goes upwards.
Let's do that. I'll see if I can pull Andy into this conversation. I want Andy on this.
Andy will only help me beat you into submission.
That's right.
Well, that could be. I want to see. At some point, I want to have Andy come on. He's got a wonderful Star Trek Power Systems talk that it would be fantastic to have him come on and do. We just need to get. I have high hopes that in the near future, his build out in his house will be done, and he will have a place where he can go and actually talk on YouTube and not have to worry about waking up sleeping children. So that is the long pole in the tent right now, is being able to do this without waking up sleeping children.
Fair enough.
Cause.
So, all right. So I think that it is time to call it.
Yep.
Sounds good.
Live long and prosper, guys. We'll see
Goodbye, everyone. See you next week.
Next week. All right. Next week. Bye.